My father's gambling debt made me the bride of the most feared mafia boss in the underworld. He didn't lose me in a card game. He sold me. And the man who bought me wasn't a monster. He was the only person who ever tried to keep me alive. My name is Elena Ashcroft. I was 24 years old when my father signed my life away to a man the entire underworld feared. I thought I was walking into a death sentence. I had no idea I was walking into the only truth that had ever mattered. Stay with me until the end of this story. And drop a like. Leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. Gulch. The call came at 11:43 on a Thursday night. Elena knew it was bad before she answered. Her father only called that late when he needed something. Money, an alibi, someone to pick him up from a location he wouldn't name until she was already in the car. She'd been through it enough times that her body had developed its own response. A tightening across the chest, a slight drop in body temperature. The specific kind of dread that only children of addicts ever learn to carry. She picked up on the third ring. Elena. His voice was wrong. Not drunk. She knew his drunk voice, the way it went soft and apologetic before turning into something uglier. This was different. This was flat. Emptied out. Dad, what happened? Not a question. She'd stopped making them into questions years ago. She heard breathing on the other end. A long pause, then, I need you to come to the Meridian District, the old parking structure on Voss Street. It's almost midnight. I know what time it is. She sat up in bed, already reaching for her jeans. Her apartment was small, a studio above a dry cleaner, the kind of place she'd moved into because it was cheap and close to the accounting firm where she worked 60-hour weeks, trying to keep herself from sliding into the same financial wreckage her father had been drowning in since her mother died. She didn't resent her life. She just knew exactly what it was. Are you hurt? She asked. Just come. She drove 20 minutes through near-empty streets. The Meridian District used to be commercial. Warehouses, small manufacturers, loading docks. Now it was half-collapsed infrastructure and the kind of darkness that swallowed streetlights whole. She found the parking structure on Voss, 6 levels of crumbling concrete with a single light burning on the ground floor, and she pulled in because her father's car was there, and she had never once in her adult life been able to drive away from him. He was standing near a support column, and he wasn't alone. There were 4 men, not police. Their posture was wrong, too loose, too comfortable in their own menace. They wore civilian clothes, but they stood the way soldiers stand, and 2 of them had their hands positioned near their jackets in a way that told Elena everything she needed to know about what was underneath. Her father looked at her when she walked in, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen before. Not guilt, not fear exactly. Something smaller than both of those things. Something that looked like a man who'd already made a decision and was only now facing what it cost. Dad! She kept walking toward him because stopping felt like admitting something. What is this? Elena. Who are these people? One of the men stepped forward. He was in his 30s, medium height, the kind of forgettable face that was probably deliberate. He had a phone in his hand and he extended it toward her without a word. The screen showed a photograph of a document. It took her a moment to process what she was looking at. A signature. Her father's handwriting. She'd grown up watching him write checks that bounced, IOU slips that never got repaid, letters to her mother promising things he never delivered. She knew his signature the way she knew the smell of his cigarettes. What is this document? She said. The man with the phone said nothing. Her father said, Elena, I need you to listen to me. What is this document? Her voice came out harder that time. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the 4 men, trying to count exits, trying to remember if she'd left her phone in the car. She had. She had left it in the car. Your father has a debt, the man with the phone said. His accent was faint, Eastern European maybe, sanded down by years in American cities. A significant debt. He has been given multiple opportunities to address this debt. He has not addressed it. How much? Elena said. The amount is no longer relevant. Everything has an amount. How much? The man looked at her for a moment with something that might have been mild interest. $800,000. The number hit her like cold water. She knew her father gambled. She'd known since she was 15 and found the notices in the kitchen drawer, the ones from loan companies and debt collectors and men who didn't have business cards. She'd bailed him out in small increments over the years, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, money she couldn't afford to give, given anyway because the alternative was watching him disappear into something worse. But 800,000 was not a number she could have prepared for. 800,000 was not a problem with a solution that looked anything like the life she was currently living. "I don't have that," she said. "We know." "Then what am I doing here?" The man put the phone in his pocket. He looked at her father, who was still standing near the column, who was looking at the floor. "The debt has been purchased," the man said, "by a third party. That party has expressed an interest in a specific arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "You will be informed when you arrive." "Arrive where?" "Miss Ashcroft." The man's voice shifted just slightly. Not warmer exactly, but more deliberate. "You are not being given a choice tonight. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you are a person who appreciates honesty. What you are being given is an opportunity to walk to the vehicle outside and come with us without difficulty, which will be better for you and significantly better for your father." She looked at her father then, really looked at him. He was 61 years old and he looked older, his face worn down by decades of bad decisions and worse luck, and the particular kind of self-destruction that wears the costume of misfortune so effectively that even the person doing it sometimes believes the disguise. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor, and she understood, in the specific cellular way that children understand their parents' worst moments, that he knew exactly what was happening here, and that he had known before he called her. She had driven herself into this parking garage. "Okay," she said. The drive took 40 minutes. They put her in the back of an SUV with tinted windows and didn't blindfold her, which she found more unsettling than if they had. Either they didn't care if she knew where she was going, or where she was going was someplace she wasn't expected to leave. She watched the city through the glass, the orange wash of highway lights, the dark stretches between neighborhoods, the gradual shift as they moved north toward the elevated districts where the houses sat behind walls and the streets had no sidewalks because no one was expected to walk anywhere. She thought about her mother, not strategically, not pulling up memory for comfort. She'd just thought about her, the way you think about a person when you're in a car going somewhere terrible and your mind needs somewhere to go that isn't forward. Her mother had died 7 years ago. Cancer, fast and uncompromising, the kind that gives you 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. What Elena remembered most was not the dying, but the 2 weeks before the diagnosis, when her mother had seemed preoccupied, distracted in a specific, purposeful way, like someone trying to finish something before time ran out. Elena had assumed it was work stress. She'd been wrong about a lot of things. The car stopped in front of a gate. The property beyond it was not what she'd expected, which she realized meant she'd expected something, chains, maybe, industrial ugliness, the visual grammar of threat. What she saw instead was a house that could have been designed by an architect who loved horizontal lines and controlled light. 3 stories, stone and glass, set back from the gate by a long drive lined with trees that were probably older than the house itself. Lights burned in several windows. There were cameras everywhere. She counted 6 just on the approach, but they were discreet, mounted to blend rather than intimidate. She was walked inside by 2 of the men from the parking garage. The interior was quiet. High ceilings. The kind of silence that exists in spaces where sound has been engineered out. There were people moving through the hallways. She caught glimpses of them, men and a few women, all moving with the focused efficiency of people who had jobs and were doing them. No one looked at her directly. She was brought to a room off the main hall, large. A sitting room of some kind, furnished with restraint, 2 couches, a low table, bookshelves that actually looked used. She was not pushed or guided into a chair. She stood. And then the door at the far end of the room opened. She had heard his name before the way most people in the city had heard it. Sideways, in conversation, in the careful way people reference things they're afraid of giving too much attention. Damien Vescari. The name appeared in news articles occasionally, always attached to words like allegedly and sources suggest, and other legal insulation. She'd heard it used as a threat. Someone's cousin owed money to people connected to Vescari. Someone's business partner had made a decision that brought them to the attention of his organization. The name meant something in the city's undercurrent, the way certain weather patterns mean something to people who live near water. She had not formed a clear picture of him. That was what she realized the moment he walked in, because the picture she'd half-assembled from fragments and rumor didn't match the man who crossed the room with no particular urgency and no performance of authority. He was tall, early 40s, dark hair cut close, the kind of face that had been made angular by time and tension rather than genetics. He was wearing a plain dark shirt, no jacket. He looked less like a crime lord than like a man who had been working late and had come downstairs to deal with something that needed to be dealt with. He stopped on the opposite side of the low table. "Elena Ashcroft," he said. Not a greeting, more like a confirmation. "Yes," she said. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Something moved in his expression. Not irritation, not amusement. She couldn't name it. "Suit yourself," he said, and sat down across from where she wasn't sitting. She watched him settle into the chair like a man who slept well at night, and she hated that more than she would have hated anything violent. Violence she'd been prepared for. This calm she didn't know what to do with. "You were told your father has a debt," he said. $800,000, apparently purchased by you. Correct. What do you want? He reached forward to the low table where there was a small object she hadn't noticed, a ring box. He opened it and set it facing her. She didn't look at what was inside. She kept her eyes on his face. "I'm proposing a marriage," he said. "Legal, documented, conducted within 72 hours. The room held that sentence for a moment. Elena's body processed it before her mind did. She felt the thing in her chest change shape, compress into something smaller and harder. "Excuse me," she said. "You heard me correctly. You want to—" She stopped, started again. "You're telling me you want me to marry you. I'm telling you the terms under which your father's debt will be resolved and his life will no longer be at risk. And if I refuse? Your father owes $800,000 to an organization that does not extend payment plans. I have purchased the debt. If you decline, the debt returns to its original holders." She understood what that meant. She understood it in the specific, pragmatic way she understood most things involving her father's catastrophes. Not with shock, but with a kind of exhausted clarity, the recognition of a shape she'd seen approaching for years from a great distance. "This is insane," she said. "Possibly. You don't know me." "I know enough." "That's not an answer." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't break apart. "You want to know why you specifically?" "Yes." "That is a conversation for after you've made your decision." "My decision." She repeated the words with the weight they deserved. "You mean whether to agree to marry a stranger to save my father from debt collectors?" "Yes." "And you're calling that a decision?" "I'm calling it a choice. There's a difference." She finally looked at the ring box. The ring inside was not ostentatious, a plain band, silver or white gold, simple. She had no idea what that was supposed to mean, if anything. "What does this marriage look like?" she said. "In practice. You live here. You have access to the property and to reasonable resources. You are not a prisoner. Except I can't leave. Except certain movements will require coordination, for your safety." "My safety." She let the irony sit there. "There are people who will want to use you the moment your connection to me becomes known. That is not a hypothetical." She looked at him. He was not performing sincerity. She'd grown up watching her father perform sincerity, and she knew what it looked like. This was something else. This was a man stating facts with the same emotional register he might use to describe weather. "Why aren't you explaining yourself more?" she said. "Most people trying to convince someone of something give you more information. Most people trying to convince someone of something want something the other person hasn't already agreed to give." She felt something cold move through her. "You think I've already agreed? I think you drove to that parking garage at midnight when your father called. I think you've been driving to parking garages at midnight for years. He paused. I think you already know what your answer is. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. She thought about her father's face in the parking structure. The floor staring, the collapsed posture of a man who'd already spent whatever coin of self-respect he'd been carrying. She thought about $800,000, a figure so large it had no real texture, no human scale. She thought about what happened to people when organizations that did not extend payment plans came to collect. She thought, briefly and without ceremony, about her own life. The studio above the dry cleaner, the 60-hour weeks, the almost complete absence of anything she was doing that was for herself rather than for damage control. She had spent her entire adult life in the defensive crouch, and here in this room with its engineered silence and its bookshelves and its man who would not pretend to be giving her a real choice, she felt the crouch in her spine in a way she usually managed not to notice. 72 hours, she said, beginning now. I want to see my father before the ceremony, wherever you're holding him. Your father is not being held. He went home. That one landed differently than the others. She felt it in her sternum, the specific percussion of something confirming what some part of her had already known. Her father had gone home. He had made his call, delivered his daughter to the parking garage, and gone home. She didn't let herself stay inside that for more than a second. I'll need to get some things from my apartment. Someone will take you tomorrow morning. She nodded once. Not agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement. The body's way of processing something the mind wasn't ready to call real. I'm going to need a room, she said. Separate from yours. Obviously. And I'm going to need to know that I can contact my employer tomorrow to make arrangements. I have responsibilities. That can be accommodated. And I want to know... She stopped, made herself say the thing directly. Are you going to hurt me? He looked at her without blinking for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was exactly as flat as it had been throughout, which was either deeply reassuring or deeply worrying, and she genuinely could not determine which. No, he said. She nodded again. The man who had brought her inside appeared at the door of the room. She hadn't heard anyone call for him, and she understood this was the part where she was taken to a room and the conversation was over. At the door she stopped because there was a question she needed to ask, and it felt important to ask it while she could still see his face. You said I could know why me specifically, after I decided. He waited. Tell me. He looked at her from across the room, and for a moment, just a moment, something in his expression shifted, not softened, moved, like tectonic movement, something deep changing the surface just slightly. You look like your mother, he said. She had no response to that, no framework for it. She filed it somewhere in the back of her mind, where she put all the things that were too big to process in real time, and she walked out of the room behind the man at the door into a house that was not her house, inside a life that was no longer the one she recognized. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of someone she didn't trust in over a decade, and she wasn't starting tonight. But walking down the corridor toward the room they'd prepared for her, she pressed her thumbnail hard into her palm, hard enough to leave a mark, just to stay inside her own body, just to stay present in the specific and immediate reality of where her feet were, where her breath was. Because if she let herself go even slightly forward or backward in time, she would lose the only thing she had left in this place. She slept badly. She didn't expect to sleep at all, but the body overrides the mind when the mind has pushed too hard for too long. And somewhere past 2 in the morning, she dropped into something thin and restless, populated by half images she couldn't hold on to. She woke at 6 to the sound of movement in the house. Doors, footsteps, the low register of voices somewhere below. She lay still for a moment with her eyes open and the ceiling above her unfamiliar and the light coming through curtains that weren't her curtains. And she understood with the clean clarity of early morning that the document in that parking garage, the one with her father's signature, had not been about a gambling debt at all. She didn't know how she knew that. She hadn't been told. There was no specific piece of evidence that had surfaced overnight, no conversation she'd filed away that now seemed different in light of new information. It was something more like pattern recognition, the trained alertness of someone who had grown up in proximity to deceit and learned to feel its particular atmospheric pressure even when she couldn't see the source. Her father had been gambling his whole life. He had a gift for accumulating debt and a remarkable talent for surviving consequences that should have been unsurvivable. $800,000 in one sitting was not impossible, but it was significant even by his standards. And the man who had purchased that debt, who had gone to the trouble of acquiring her specifically, who had referenced her mother with an expression she still couldn't decode, who had a ring sitting ready in a box on a table as though the outcome of the evening had never really been in question, that man was not doing this because of an unpaid gambling debt. She sat up in the strange bed in the strange room. Outside the window, she could see a section of the grounds, shaped hedgerows, a stretch of lawn, a section of high stone wall at the perimeter. 3 cameras in her line of sight, all positioned to watch the grounds, not the interior. Whoever Damien Viscari was afraid of, they were out there, not in here. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm again. There was something her father wasn't telling her. There was something Damien Viscari wasn't telling her. And somewhere at the intersection of those 2 withheld truths was whatever she actually was in this story. Not a daughter, not a debt, not a bride. She needed to find out what that was before the 72 hours were up. She needed to find out before she signed her name on anything, because she had done the math, lying there in the thin dark hours, and $800,000 multiplied by 1 targeted daughter equaled something that had nothing to do with cards. And the man who had told her she looked like her mother had known her mother well enough to say it with that expression, with that particular movement beneath his face. And her mother had been dead for 7 years, and in those 7 years Elena had never once heard the name Damien Viscari come out of her father's mouth. Not once. Her father, who knew everyone who owed money to everyone else. Her father, who ran in the specific social circles where that name would have come up. Her father, who had delivered her to a parking garage at midnight and gone home. The morning light shifted. Somewhere below her, the house continued its organized life, people moving through corridors with purpose, an organization functioning with the kind of quiet discipline that didn't need to perform itself. Elena got up. She washed her face with water that was the right temperature, because of course, it was. She looked at herself in the mirror, tired, alert, the specific expression of someone in the first hour of understanding that the ground they thought they were standing on had been a different thing entirely. She needed to call her father, not for comfort, not even for answers. She'd given up expecting those. She needed to hear his voice and listen to what he wasn't saying. She went to the door of her room and opened it. The man standing in the corridor, tall, 50s, with the kind of stillness that came from a long career in patience, looked at her without surprise. "I need a phone," she said. "Mr. Viscari would like to speak with you first," he said. "Breakfast is ready downstairs." She studied his face for a moment. It was professionally neutral, but there was something in the set of it, something almost protective in the careful way he was watching her, that she couldn't quite account for. "Fine," she said. She followed him down the corridor, down the stairs, toward the smell of coffee and whatever conversation Damien Viscari had decided she needed to have before she was allowed to make a phone call. Behind her, in the room she'd just left, the curtains shifted slightly in a draft from the heating system. And in the corridor below, moving quickly past an intersecting hallway, 2 men were talking in voices too low for her to catch, and one of them was carrying a folder thick with photographs. And on the top photograph, which she only glimpsed for half a second before the hallway angle took it from her view, was a face she recognized, not her father's, her mother's. She didn't stop walking. That was the thing she held on to afterward. She didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't give any visible sign that the half-second glimpse of her dead mother's photograph in the hands of a man moving through the corridor below had detonated something inside her chest. She kept her feet moving, kept her shoulders level, kept her face in the expression of controlled neutrality she'd been building since she was 15 years old, and had learned that showing a reaction in her father's house was an invitation for something worse. The man leading her downstairs, the one with the stillness of a long career in patience, didn't look back at her. He moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had escorted people through this house many times, and had no reason to think this morning was different from any other. She let him think that. The dining room was off the main hall, a long table set for 2 at one end, Windows looking out onto the grounds, morning light coming in flat and gray through glass that was probably thicker than standard. Damien Viscari was already seated. He had coffee. He had a newspaper, actual print, folded beside his plate. He looked up when she walked in with the expression of a man who had expected her to arrive at exactly this moment, which she found either impressive or infuriating and settled on both. "Sit down," he said. You keep saying that. You keep making it necessary." She sat, not because he told her to, because her legs were tired and she'd slept 4 hours in a strange bed, and she needed coffee with an urgency that was overriding most of her other priorities. A woman appeared from a door near the far wall and poured coffee without being asked. She was in her 40s, efficient, gave Elena a look that lasted half a second longer than necessary before she withdrew. Elena filed that away. "I saw a photograph," Elena said. "Downstairs, someone was carrying it." Damien didn't look up from whatever he was reading in the newspaper. "What kind of photograph?" "My mother." He set the newspaper down, not dramatically. Just set it down, placed his coffee cup precisely, looked at her with that expression she still hadn't been able to fully decode. It had layers in it. Something controlled over something that was not controlled. "Where?" he said. "The corridor past the second stairwell. 2 men. One of them had a folder." He didn't respond immediately. He reached for his coffee, drank, set it back. "That," he said, "is a matter I was going to come to." "Come to it now." "Elena, I agreed to 72 hours. I did not agree to a managed information schedule." She kept her voice level. It cost her something. "You told me last night that I looked like my mother. You said it like it meant something specific. Now someone in your house is carrying around photographs of a woman who has been dead for 7 years. So come to it now." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the windows, the grounds were quiet. 2 men moving along the perimeter wall in the distance with the unhurried pace of a regular patrol. She counted them automatically, noted their trajectory, noted the gap they'd leave when they turned the corner. "Your mother's name was Catherine Ashcroft," he said. "I know my mother's name. Before she married your father, her name was Catherine Mercer. She worked for 11 years as a forensic financial analyst, privately contracted, not government. She was very good at finding money that didn't want to be found." Elena kept her breathing even. "I know what my mother did." "Do you know who she worked for in the last 3 years before her diagnosis?" The question sat there. Elena wrapped her hands around the coffee cup because they wanted to do something, and gripping was better than any of the alternatives. "No," she said. "She worked indirectly for me. She was tracing a financial network, a system of accounts and shell structures that had been used for 2 decades to move money between 6 organized crime families in this city and keep them operating without leaving any single trail back to any single source." He paused. "She was very close to completing that trace when she got sick." "She died," Elena said. "She got sick, and she died." "Yes." "Are you telling me it wasn't—" "I'm telling you the timing was real. The cancer was real." His voice was flat and direct, no softening in it. I investigated thoroughly, and I am certain of that. She died of the disease, not of anything else." Elena breathed again. "But," she said, "but the work she was doing didn't die with her. She was meticulous. She kept records, encrypted, distributed across multiple locations, with access protocols that she designed herself. Before she died, she hid those records somewhere. We have been trying to find them for 7 years. We. My organization, and the people my organization opposes. And my father, your father knew what she was doing in broad strokes. He didn't have the technical capacity to understand the specifics, but he knew she was working on something significant. After her death, certain parties became aware of this and began using his debts as leverage." Damien picked up his coffee again. "The $800,000 your father owes is not from gambling, or rather, it is from gambling, because your father genuinely cannot stop gambling. That part is real. But the debt was purchased and consolidated specifically to create a mechanism of control. To get to you. To get to me." She repeated it. "Why me?" "Because your mother's records are keyed to you." He set the cup down. We don't know the exact mechanism. She was careful. But every path we've found leads to the same conclusion. Catherine Mercer hid the final piece of her work in something connected to her daughter. Not a location, not a physical object we've found. Something she gave you, told you, encoded in something that passed between the two of you. The dining room felt very still. Outside, the patrol had rounded the corner. She'd stopped counting. "You think I'm carrying some piece of information and don't know it," she said. "I think your mother was thorough enough to hide something in a way that would survive 7 years of pressure from people trying to find it. And you need it to. The network your mother was tracing is still operational. It has been for 7 years since her death. It funds and protects the rival syndicate that has been trying to dismantle my organization for 3 years. If we can complete her work, finish the trace she started, we can expose every account, every shell company, every transaction. The entire structure collapses. The people it protects lose their insulation overnight." Elena sat with that for a moment. She thought about her mother, not abstractly, not the photograph she'd glimpsed, but the real texture of her. The way she'd worked late in her home office with the door slightly open so Elena could hear the sound of typing when she fell asleep. The way she'd been meticulous about everything. Receipts, records, the filing system in the kitchen that everyone joked about, and that was actually perfect. The way, in those last weeks, she'd been preoccupied with something she wasn't sharing. "She didn't tell me anything," Elena said. "I was 17 when she died. She didn't tell me about financial networks or shell companies or, I know, whatever she left you, she left it in a way you wouldn't recognize as significant, something that seemed ordinary. You've had 7 years to think about this." "Yes. And you brought me here because you think living in close proximity to whatever records or resources you have will help me figure it out." "Partially." "What's the other part?" He was quiet for a moment. This silence was different from the controlled ones earlier. It had something uncertain in it, something that didn't fit the profile of the man she'd been reading since she walked into this house. "The rival syndicate," he said, "has been moving against me for 3 years. Last month, they acquired your father's debt. 2 weeks ago, one of my people identified a surveillance team watching your apartment building." He paused. "You were already in danger before I brought you here. I moved when I did because waiting longer would have meant they moved first. So this is what? Protective custody in the shape of an engagement. The marriage creates a legal and social connection that has practical value in our world. It changes your status. It gives you the protection of my organization in a way that can be enforced. Or it makes me a target. You were already a target. Now you are a target with a wall around you." She looked at her plate. She hadn't eaten. She wasn't sure she could. "You could have told me this last night," she said. "Last night you needed to make a decision about whether to stay. The details of why would have made that harder, not easier. That's a very controlling way to manage someone. It's an honest explanation of a controlling choice, which I think is worth something." She looked up at him. "My father. You said he went home. You said he wasn't being held." "Correct. He knew about this, about my mother's work. He knew about the debt being a mechanism. He knew they were watching my apartment." Damien said nothing. "He called me to that parking garage," she said. "He called me there and he stood next to those men and he let them put me in an SUV and he went home." She pressed her thumbnail into her palm under the table where he couldn't see it. "Did he know they were going to bring me here specifically?" "Yes." "Did he know about the marriage arrangement?" "Yes." She absorbed that. She thought she'd already absorbed the version of it she'd understood last night. The floor staring, the empty face, the man who'd made his decision before he picked up the phone. But there were layers to this particular wound, and each layer hurt differently. "He sold me," she said. Not a question. He was presented with an arrangement that cleared his debts and gave him money besides. He agreed to it. "How much?" $50,000. She laughed. It came out wrong. Too short. Too sharp. Nothing funny in it. $50,000. 20 years of her patching holes in his life. 20 years of late-night calls and bad addresses and money she couldn't afford to send because what was the alternative? $50,000. Not even a fraction of the debt, just enough to make the next few months' worth of bad decisions feel funded. "I need to use a phone," she said. "Not to call him. I need to call my employer." "That can be arranged. Now, before anything else happens today." He nodded once, and the man from the corridor, the one with the careful stillness, appeared at the door as though summoned, and she wondered how many people in this house were positioned to appear when needed, and how they knew when that was. She spent 20 minutes on a borrowed phone in a room off the hallway, talking to her supervisor in the careful language of someone explaining a family emergency without explaining a family emergency. Her supervisor was decent about it, concerned in the particular way of a person who has developed professional warmth without overstepping into real intimacy. Elena held herself together for the duration of the call, thanked him, ended it, and then sat for 40 seconds in the chair with her eyes closed and her hands flat on her thighs. 40 seconds. Then she got up. The rest of the morning was a tour she hadn't asked for, conducted by the man she now understood was something like Damien's chief of operations, a compact gray-haired man named Reeves, who moved through the house with the proprietary ease of someone who'd been inside it longer than anyone else currently standing. He showed her the library, the kitchen's informal breakfast area, the gym, the secure communications room she would not have access to, the courtyard garden that was apparently functional in warmer months. He showed her all of this with the professional courtesy of someone orienting a new employee, which was approximately what she was, she supposed, in the taxonomy of this arrangement. She asked questions, specific ones, about the property's layout, about staff schedules, about which areas were under camera surveillance and which weren't. Reeves answered with what felt like deliberate transparency, and she couldn't tell if this was a policy of honesty or an assessment of her, and she stopped trying to tell the difference because the data was useful, regardless of which it was. She met 3 other people in the course of that morning. A woman named Sasha, who was in her 30s and wore her authority the way some people wear expensive clothing, lightly because she'd had it long enough not to need to announce it. A younger man named Cord, who looked like he'd been hired for his size and had turned out to also be smart about it, which seemed to have surprised some people but had stopped surprising him. And a man named Ferris, who was introduced to her as Damien's senior advisor, who shook her hand with a slight bow of his head and said it was a pleasure, and looked at her with eyes that were doing something complicated underneath the professionalism. She shook his hand and smiled and noted the eyes. That afternoon, Reeves took her to her apartment to collect her things. He came with 2 other men, and they stood at a discreet distance while she moved through her studio with a bag, pulling together the practical infrastructure of a life being relocated. Clothes, documents, her laptop, the small box in the back of her closet where she kept things that mattered, photographs, her mother's watch, a notebook she'd had since she was 19. She stood in the middle of her apartment for a moment before they left. It smelled like her particular life. Coffee from this morning still faint in the air, the dry cleaning chemical from downstairs, the specific dust of a space that didn't get quite enough light. She had not loved this apartment. She had lived in it the way you live in a place you chose for practicality, useful, functional, sufficient, but it was hers, and the specific quality of its yoursness was only obvious now that she was leaving it, probably for a long time, possibly for good. She picked up her bag and walked out. Back at the estate, she unpacked in the room they'd given her and spent an hour at the desk with her laptop going through her email and her calendar and the small, manageable obligations of a life she was putting into suspension. Somewhere below her, the house ran. Somewhere in it, Damien Vescari was doing whatever he did with his days, managing whatever a man managed when he ran a criminal organization that was apparently at war with a rival syndicate that had been using her dead mother's unfinished work as a weapon. She opened the notebook from the box in her closet. It was one she'd used in her last year of college. Notes from classes, margins full of the particular shorthand she'd developed studying accounting, dates and names, and the compressed notation of someone processing a lot of information quickly. She'd kept it for no specific reason. It was just a thing she hadn't thrown away. She paged through it slowly, looking for she didn't know what. Midway through the notebook, between 2 pages of lecture notes from a financial modeling class, was a folded piece of paper she didn't remember putting there. It was not her handwriting. The paper was folded small, creased and slightly soft with age. The kind of softness that comes from paper being carried in a pocket or handled regularly before being put somewhere for safekeeping. She unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting, 4 lines. No heading, no date. The first line was a number sequence, 22 digits. The second was a single word she didn't recognize. The third was what looked like an account designation, the kind of alphanumeric string used in institutional financial systems. The fourth line said, "You'll know when it's time. I love you. Don't trust the one who seems safest." Elena sat for a very long time without moving. She thought about the man named Ferris with his slight bow and his professional eyes doing something complicated underneath. She thought about 7 years. 7 years of this piece of paper folded inside a notebook she'd moved from apartment to apartment without ever opening. She thought about her mother at her home office desk, door slightly open, the sound of typing in the dark. She refolded the paper. She did not put it back in the notebook. She folded it smaller and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, the one with the zipper that sat flat against her ribs. Then she went downstairs. Damien was in the room off the main hall, the same one she'd been brought to last night. He was standing at a table with Reeves and Ferris, the three of them looking at something spread across the surface. She heard their voices before she rounded the doorway. A conversation conducted in the particular low register of men discussing something serious, and she stopped just outside. Movement in the eastern sector last night. 3 vehicles. They weren't ours. Reeves's voice clipped, factual. Did Nolan confirm? Damien? Nolan confirmed 2. The third was confirmed by me. Ferris's voice slightly smoother than the others. I ran the plates this morning. They're clean registrations, but the pattern matches the team they used in the Whitmore operation last fall. A pause. Then they're positioning, Damien said. Looks like it. They're probably waiting for the announcement. The announcement isn't public yet. It doesn't need to be public. They have someone inside. They've had someone inside. Another pause. Longer. Run it again, Damien said. Everyone who had access to the schedule in the last 2 weeks. Every name. I want it on my desk by 6. That's a short list, Ferris said. Then it should be easy. Elena stepped into the doorway. All 3 men turned. Reeves's expression didn't change. Damien looked at her with the alert attention he seemed to direct at everything. Comprehensive, unhurried, missing nothing. Ferris looked at her with his polished professionalism, the slight incline of acknowledgement, and those eyes doing their complicated work underneath. There's something inside your organization, she said. Someone passing information to the rival syndicate. None of them spoke. I heard enough, she said, before anyone could ask. Not everything. Enough. Damien looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ferris and Reeves. Give us a minute. Reeves moved immediately. Ferris moved 1 beat after, which she noticed. When they were alone, Damien said, You shouldn't be walking through the house without... I know what I heard, she said, and I need to tell you something. She crossed the room to the table. She did not take the folded paper out of her jacket, not yet, because she had heard what she'd heard, and she had her mother's warning in her inside pocket, and she was standing in a room with a man she didn't know well enough to trust, except that he was the man her mother had apparently trusted enough to work for, and the calculation on all of that was not yet resolved. I found something, she said, something my mother left. I need to know something from you before I tell you what it is. He waited. Ferris, she said, how long has he worked for you? Damien's expression shifted, that tectonic movement again, beneath the surface. 11 years, he said. And you trust him? I did. The past tense sat between them like a third person in the room. Something changed, she said. Recently. There are indicators. Nothing confirmed. The short list, she said. The people with access to the schedule. Ferris is on it. She looked at him. He looked back. And something in the room changed temperature. Not warmth, nothing that comfortable, but a recalibration. A mutual arrival at the same point from different directions. The photograph this morning, she said. The men in the corridor with the folder. I sent them to review archived material related to your mother's work. I was going to tell you about it this morning at breakfast. Before or after you told me about the network? After. In that order? Yes. She thought about the sequencing, the managed information schedule she'd already called him on. She thought about it for 3 seconds and made a decision. She reached into her inside pocket and took out the folded paper. She set it on the table between them without unfolding it. My mother left me this, she said. Inside a notebook I've had for 6 years and never looked at. I found it an hour ago. She watched his face. Before you read it, I need you to understand something. The last line of it is a warning. I'm choosing to show it to you anyway. I need you to understand what that means, what I'm risking by telling you instead of Ferris, instead of Reeves, instead of nobody. It means you've made a calculation, he said. It means I've made a bet. She looked at him. Don't make me wrong about it. He reached for the paper and unfolded it carefully, and she watched his face as he read. He went through it once, then again. His expression was controlled throughout, but when he reached the last line, she was watching for it. Something moved in him that he didn't fully suppress. Something that looked almost like grief if you caught it in the right half second. He set the paper down. The account designation, he said. I know what system it belongs to. It's from the network your mother was tracing. This number, he touched the 22-digit sequence, is a master key. It would unlock the complete transaction history. Every transfer, every account, every name attached to every shell structure for 20 years. And the word. It's an identifier for a specific server location where the data is archived. He looked up at her. Elena, this is... He stopped. Restarted. This is everything we've needed for 3 years. And Ferris knows we have it now, she said. The room took a breath. Ferris wasn't in here when you showed it to me. No, but he was right outside. And if he's been feeding information to the syndicate for however long, and if your organization's internal leak means they've already been watching for signs that I might have something like this. She paused. How long before someone outside that door knows what just happened in here? Damien moved to the door in 3 strides and opened it. The corridor was empty. He turned back, and she could see him recalculating. The particular quality of a person who has been running an operation for a long time and is now rapidly updating every assumption he's been operating on. We need to move the information before he has time to report, she said. And we need to do it in a way that looks like nothing happened. Like I came downstairs and we talked, and it was ordinary. He looked at her from the doorway. You've done this before. This kind of thinking. I grew up with a man who lied to everyone constantly, she said. You learn to think inside other people's information. He was quiet for a moment, then, the ceremony, the marriage documentation. I was going to push it to the end of the 72 hours. I'm moving it to tomorrow morning. Because once it's documented, my status changes. Because once it's documented, certain decisions about you require my explicit authorization. It limits what they can do without triggering protocols that would expose the move. He came back into the room, moving quickly now, the controlled efficiency of someone shifting from deliberation to action. Stay visible tonight. Dinner. Stay in common areas. If Ferris is watching for a reaction, give him nothing to read. And the paper. I'll handle the account information separately, through channels Ferris has no access to. He paused. Where do you want to put the original? She thought about that for 1 second. Give it back to me. She held out her hand. It's mine. He handed it back. She put it in her jacket pocket, zipper closed. She spent the next 4 hours being visible. In the library, in the informal kitchen area, in the courtyard for 40 minutes in the gray afternoon air. She made herself seem like a woman adjusting to strange new circumstances in the ordinary ways, slightly subdued, occasionally tense, not performing composure, but not falling apart either. She talked briefly with Sasha, who was precise and watchful and warmer than her initial presentation. She ate dinner at the long table with Damien and Reeves and 2 others she hadn't yet cataloged, and the conversation was surface level, and she contributed to it in small, calibrated doses. Ferris arrived late to dinner. He sat across the table from her and was charming in the way of someone who has practiced charm until it's indistinguishable from the real thing. And she watched him over her plate and thought about her mother's handwriting. Don't trust the one who seems safest, and kept her face in the expression of a woman who had found nothing in a notebook that afternoon, who had spent the hour before dinner reading in the library, who was simply, ordinarily, adaptably present. He watched her too. She felt it. The specific quality of attention that is not curiosity but assessment. The gaze of a person who is looking for information rather than connection. She'd felt it this morning when he'd shaken her hand. She felt it more clearly now, knowing what she knew. After dinner, she excused herself and went upstairs. She was halfway down the second-floor corridor when she heard it. A conversation from a room with the door not quite shut. Two voices, one of them Ferris's, the other unfamiliar and slightly distorted, the quality of a voice on a speakerphone. She stopped. Can't confirm she has it yet. She's been careful. She's been there less than 24 hours. The distorted voice had patience in it, the kind of patience that came from controlling a situation. Vescari moved the ceremony up, tomorrow morning. A pause. That's a problem. It doesn't have to be. If she has what we think she has, she hasn't given it to him yet. She doesn't know who to trust. She will. Not if we move first. Ferris's voice, quieter now. I can create an opportunity tomorrow, before the ceremony. What kind of opportunity? Something that separates her from him long enough to make contact. She's her father's daughter. She'll respond to family pressure. If Thomas calls her, her father is a liability. Her father is a tool, Ferris said. He's been a tool this entire time. One more use won't break him. Elena stood in the corridor with her back flat against the wall and her heart doing something loud and irregular inside her chest. And she thought about the word safest, and she thought about 72 hours, and she thought about tomorrow morning, and she understood with the specific cold clarity of someone who has just run out of time for careful calculations that she had approximately 8 hours to decide whether to tell Damien what she'd just heard before Ferris decided to move first. She moved down the corridor without making a sound, and behind the door that wasn't quite closed, Ferris kept talking to the distorted voice. And outside the house, the night patrols moved along the perimeter wall. And somewhere in the city, her father was spending money that had been paid for her. And the clock that had been running since she drove into that parking garage was ticking down to something she couldn't yet see the shape of, but could feel the weight of, heavy and coming fast. She went to Damien's door at 11:47. She knew the number because she'd been watching the clock on the nightstand in her room since she'd come upstairs, lying on top of the covers, fully dressed, running the conversation she'd heard through her head at varying speeds, looking for angles she'd missed, exits she hadn't considered. There weren't many. Ferris was going to move tomorrow. He was going to use her father as a lever. He had access to the house's internal schedule, which meant he knew when and where the ceremony was planned, which meant he could time whatever he was planning with the precision of someone who'd been inside this operation for 11 years and knew exactly which seams to pull. She had one advantage. He didn't know she'd heard him. She knocked twice, quietly. Damien opened the door after 4 seconds. Not the delay of someone woken from sleep, but the specific quickness of someone already awake and working. He was dressed. He had a phone in his hand. His expression when he saw her shifted through something fast and then settled back into the controlled register she'd been reading him in since last night. I heard Ferris, she said. On the phone. An hour ago. He stood back from the door. She came in and told him everything. Not in order of impact, but in order of occurrence. The way she'd processed it, which was the way she'd been trained by years of accounting work to present information. Sequence first, interpretation after. The corridor. The door not quite closed. Ferris's voice and the distorted one. The plan to use her father to separate her from Damien before the ceremony. The phrase, one more use won't break him. She watched him while she talked. He stood with his arms at his sides, very still, and she had the sense of enormous machinery moving very quietly behind his eyes. When she finished, he didn't speak immediately. He moved to the desk in the corner of the room and set his phone down with careful precision, the way you set something down when you need your hands free for whatever comes next. The voice on the phone, he said. Anything specific? Accent? Pitch? Any identifiable quality? Distorted? Speakerphone or some kind of filter. Patient. Male, I think, but I'm not certain. The patience was the most distinctive thing, the way he talked like someone who was waiting for something that was already guaranteed. Time of the call. I heard it between 10:15 and 10:30, approximately. I didn't have my phone. He nodded once. Go back to your room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except Reeves until I come for you. Not staff, not Sasha, not anyone else. Not Ferris. Especially not Ferris. He moved to the door with her, but stopped before opening it. Looked at her directly. You came to me with this? Yes. You could have used it differently. Could have let it play out. Ferris would have made contact with you, offered you something, a way out probably, access to information, money. You would have had options. I had a piece of paper in my jacket pocket that could take down a criminal network, she said. Ferris wanted it. The people he works for wanted it. You want it for something different, and my mother trusted you enough to build the key around something she gave me. She met his eyes. That's not a complicated calculation. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in him acknowledged what she'd said without making it larger than it was. Go, he said. Lock the door. She went. She lay on top of the covers again, this time without watching the clock. She thought about her mother's note, the 4 lines, the account designation, the warning. Don't trust the one who seems safest. Ferris, with his 11 years and his professional ease and his polished courtesy. The one who fit, who'd been expected to be trustworthy by sheer duration of presence. The one who'd had time to make himself look like furniture. She slept at some point because she woke at 5:30 to a sound that her body registered before her mind did. Something below, muffled. The percussive quality of movement that wasn't routine. She was at the door before she was fully awake. Reeves was in the corridor. He was already moving toward her, which meant he'd been watching for her to surface, which meant the night had not been quiet. What happened? She said. Get dressed, quickly. His voice had dropped the professional courtliness of the previous day. What was underneath it was efficient and tight. Bring what you need. Nothing heavy. She was dressed in 3 minutes. She took her bag, the one she'd packed at her apartment, still half organized, and the jacket with the inside pocket, and she went into the corridor where Reeves was waiting with an expression that had resolved into something focused and grim. Where's Damien? She said. Occupied. That's not an answer. It's the answer you have right now. Move. She moved. He took her down a staircase she hadn't been shown on the tour. Narrow, utilitarian, the bones of the house behind the finished surfaces. It came out in a basement level she hadn't known existed. Stone floor, overhead fluorescence, the particular cold of underground spaces. There were 2 other people already there, Cord, the large young man she'd met yesterday, and a woman she didn't recognize, small and dark-haired, who was checking something on a tactical vest with the focused attention of someone who did this often. What is happening? Elena said to Reeves. Ferris moved his timeline up. Reeves stopped near the far wall, beside a heavy door that looked like it led somewhere outward. We don't know why yet. He made a call at 2 a.m. 40 minutes later, one of the perimeter cameras went dark. Then a second one. An attack. A preparation. Their positioning. The ceremony was scheduled for 8 a.m., and they needed to move before that. He looked at her with the quality of someone delivering information efficiently, without cushioning. Ferris was detained at 3 a.m. He's been, he paused slightly, interviewed. By Damien. Yes. She processed the word interviewed and what it meant in this context and kept her face neutral. And the picture is larger than we thought. He paused again. There's something you need to hear, Elena. I want to tell you before you hear it from another source. He said her name with a slight change in register. Not softer exactly, but differently weighed. Like it had more history in it than a one-day acquaintance should carry. She noticed it. Tell me, she said, your father was not simply told about the arrangement between you and Mr. Viscari. He was part of the planning for it. He has been working with the rival syndicate for 18 months. She waited for that to land. It landed. Working with them how? She said. Providing information. About you, primarily. Your schedule? Your habits? Your connections? When you last contacted him? Whether you'd ever mentioned your mother's work. Reeves's eyes were steady on her face. He led them to the conclusion that you likely possessed something Catherine had hidden. He helped them design the debt purchase mechanism specifically to create a scenario where you could be acquired. Acquired, she repeated. The word had a particular ugliness. That was their word, from Ferris's phone records. She was standing on the stone floor of an underground room with the cold coming up through the soles of her shoes and her father's choices stacked in a column in front of her so high she couldn't see the top of them. 18 months. He had been telling them about her schedule, her habits, when she last called. For 18 months, while she'd been wiring him money and fielding late-night calls and showing up when he needed a face in a parking garage at midnight, she pressed her thumbnail into her palm, hard. The $50,000, she said, was a partial payment. There's more contingent on delivery. Delivery of me, or of what I have. Both. The woman with the tactical vest looked up from her work briefly and then looked back down, which Elena noted as a kind of professional courtesy. She breathed through it. She filed it. She was not going to fall apart in this room, and she was not going to let the architecture of her father's betrayal take up more space than the current situation required, because the current situation required her to be functional and present. And she was going to be those things, or she was going to be something this house's people had to carry, and she was not going to be the second thing. "What's the plan?" she said. Reeves looked at her for a moment with that same strangely weighted quality. "We wait for Mr. Vescari's clearance to move you to a secondary location. Cord and Mira," he indicated the woman with the vest, "will accompany you. Once you're clear, we address the external team that's been positioning on the property." "How many of them?" "Current estimate is 11. It may be more." "And Damien?" "He stays." That's... She stopped herself from saying insane because it was a strategic position, not insanity, and she was trying to think like someone who understood strategic positions. "He's staying to manage the response." "Yes." "And the people Ferris called, his contact on the phone. We have a partial trace, not complete. That's part of what Mr. Vescari is currently..." Reeves paused for the same fraction of a second he'd paused before. "Working through with Ferris." She heard the subterranean gunshot before she processed what it was. It was single, muffled, coming from somewhere above and to the left, and then there were two more in quick succession, and the quality of the sound told her they weren't inside the house, but close, on the grounds near the north face. Cord moved instantly, putting himself between Elena and the heavy door, not the direction of the sound, but covering the egress point, which was exactly the right instinct, and told her he was better trained than his age suggested. Reeves had his phone to his ear. "Report," he said. Listened. His face didn't change. "Hold the north corridor. Do not move on the courtyard until I confirm." He lowered the phone. "They've come in through the perimeter wall. 2 confirmed, possibly more." "The ceremony," Elena said. "They're moving because of the ceremony." "Yes." "They can't let the documentation go through. It changes my legal status, changes what they can do with..." She stopped. Something shifted in her thinking. A gear moved. "Reeves. The account information. The 22-digit sequence my mother left. You know about it. Damien told you." Reeves looked at her. "Did he tell anyone else before detaining Ferris?" A pause. 1 beat too long. "He told Sasha," Reeves said, "for operational reasons, Shikti. She runs the secure communications infrastructure." "When?" "Last night. After..." He stopped. "After I showed him the paper." She felt something cold move through her stomach. "And Sasha's current location." Reeves pressed the phone to his ear again. He spoke 3 words into it. Waited. Then lowered it, and she saw in his face, in the carefully maintained professional face of a man who had been managing crises for a long time, something that looked like the arrival of a conclusion he'd been hoping to avoid. "Sasha is not responding," he said. The cold thing in Elena's stomach settled into something solid. "How long has Sasha been in the house?" she said. 8 years. "And Ferris?" 11. And one of them turned. She looked at him. "Reeves. How long have you been in the house?" He met her eyes. 14 years, he said, and then, with the particular quality of someone delivering a prepared truth at the moment it has become unavoidable. "I knew your mother, Elena. Not professionally. She came to Mr. Vescari in the last year of her life, and she brought documentation of what she'd found, and she asked for his help and his protection for the work. She knew the people she was exposing would come for it. She knew they'd come for anyone connected to it. He stopped. She asked him to look after you, if anything happened to her, if the work ever surfaced again. Elena stood in the underground room with gunshots somewhere above her that had now stopped, which was either better or worse than while they were happening, and looked at the man who had been in the corridor outside her room this morning, waiting for her to wake up, and understood in the specific, cellular way she understood the worst things, that the careful stillness she'd read in him since yesterday was not the stillness of a professional. It was the stillness of a person who had been keeping a promise for 7 years. "You've been watching me," she said, "before last night. At a distance, irregularly, to make sure you were safe. Does Damien know you just told me this? He would have told you himself, after the ceremony. But you're telling me now. Because the situation has changed and you deserve to be operating with full information." His voice carried no apology in it, which she respected. "Your mother trusted Mr. Vescari. She trusted him with her work, and she trusted him with you. What happened last night, your decision to show him the paper, that was her judgment expressing itself through you. I believe that. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it, later." The door at the top of the narrow staircase opened, and Damien came down it fast, moving with the particular controlled urgency of a man running an operation that had gone off script and was now running on improvisation. He was not unharmed. There was blood on the left side of his collar, dark against the dark fabric, and he was holding his phone with one hand and had the other pressed briefly to his side in a way that he dropped when he saw her looking. "You're hit," she said. "It's minor." His voice was flat. "We need to move." Sasha opened the east gate remotely 12 minutes ago. There are additional people on the property. We don't have a full count yet. Ferris. Ferris is no longer a problem. The way he said it left no room for elaboration. The person running his side of this operation is someone we've been unable to identify for 3 years. Based on what Ferris told me in the last hour, we now have a partial identification. He looked at her directly. "It's not a name you'll recognize from criminal context. It's a name you'll recognize from another one. Tell me." "Senator Warren Aldis." The name went through her like electricity, not because she knew him as what Damien was implying, but because she knew him as a face, a public face, someone who appeared in news coverage of law enforcement initiatives, of anti-corruption task forces, of hearings about organized crime that had generated real-sounding policy and zero real consequences. She'd seen his face on a fundraising poster outside the courthouse 2 weeks ago. The kind of poster that exists in civic spaces, that becomes part of the background of a city until you stop seeing it. "He's been running the syndicate from inside the government," she said, "for 20 years. Your mother's financial network, the thing she was tracing, it runs through his office, through his campaign finance structure, through the charitable foundations he chairs. He's not just connected to organized crime. He is the mechanism that has kept it protected from prosecution." Damien looked at her. "The account sequence your mother left, the 22 digits, it accesses records that link his office directly to 38 distinct criminal transactions. If those records go public, his insulation disappears. His people go to prison. Every organization he's protected collapses without its legal cover. And he's known for 3 years that you were trying to find it. He's known for 7 years since your mother died. Above them, something heavy moved, running feet, more than one person. Cord looked at Damien with a question in his posture, and Damien shook his head once, then looked at Elena. "There's an underground access corridor that runs to a secondary property 3 blocks east. You go with Cord and Mira. Reeves stays with me." He looked at Reeves briefly, and something passed between them that had the quality of a long-established shorthand. "When you're clear, contact me on the secondary line. The number's in Cord's phone." "And the ceremony," Elena said. Something in his expression shifted. "When this is over." "No." She surprised herself with the word, the firmness of it. He looked at her. "If we're splitting up right now with unknown people on this property and a senator running a criminal syndicate apparently invested in keeping me from signing a document, I want to sign the document before we split up. Elena, there's no time to 5 minutes. She held his gaze. You have the documentation? He stared at her for 3 seconds. Then something in him made a decision. He turned to Reeves. The folder. Reeves produced it from inside his jacket with the efficiency of a man who had been carrying it precisely in case. Elena thought about that. About a man who'd put the ceremony documents inside his jacket before coming downstairs into an active security situation, and understood that she was not the only person in this room who'd been running calculations. They signed the documentation in the underground room while Cord watched the heavy door and Mira listened to something in an earpiece and the sounds of an ongoing security situation move through the floors above them. It took 4 minutes. Damien's handwriting was precise and unhurried. Hers was steady because she made it steady through an act of will she would not think about until later. Reeves witnessed it. Now go, Damien said. The underground corridor was exactly what it sounded like, narrow, lit by lights mounted in the low ceiling, with the particular quality of a space built for function and no other consideration. Cord led, Mira behind her, and Elena moved between them through the dark and the cold air, carrying her bag and the jacket with the zipper pocket, listening to the fading sound of activity behind them getting quieter the farther they went. She was 50 meters into the corridor when her phone, the borrowed one Damien had arranged for her, buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number. She should not have answered it. She knew this with the pragmatic clarity of someone who had just signed her name in an underground room while an armed team moved through the house above her. She should have let it go to whatever passed for voicemail and kept walking. She answered it. Elena, her father's voice. Raw in a way she'd never heard it. Stripped of the layers he usually kept between himself and whatever he was actually feeling. Elena, listen to me. I need you to listen. I know what you did, she said. Her voice came out flat and even. Cord glanced back at her. She kept moving. 18 months. I know all of it. A silence, long enough that she thought he might disconnect. It was never supposed to go this far, he said. What was it supposed to go? They told me it would be... They said he would keep you safe, that it was just about the information, that once they had what they needed... Dad! She stopped walking. Cord stopped. She held up one finger. Wait. And turned slightly away from both of them, giving herself a half shell of privacy in a tunnel that didn't really offer it. You sold me. You took money for me, and you told people who wanted to use me where I was and what I did every day for 18 months. Whatever they told you is not the point. Whatever you believed is not the point. She kept her voice level through the specific act of will that her body had developed over 30 years of practice. Why are you calling? Because they told me to. His voice broke slightly on it. Not performance. She knew performance. Something else. Elena, they sent someone to my apartment tonight. There are 2 men here. They told me to call you and tell you to come, that if you bring what you found in your mother's things, they'll let me... No. The word was immediate. Elena, no. She felt something in her sternum go very quiet and very still, like a clock stopping. If you're telling me the truth about the 2 men, then call the police. Call them the moment I hang up. Tell them there are men in your apartment. That's the only thing I'm telling you to do. If I call the police, they'll... Call them or don't. But I'm not coming. She paused. 1 breath. 2. I'm not coming, Dad. She ended the call. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone in her hand and the cold air moving through from somewhere ahead. Cord was watching her with the careful neutrality of a person who had learned not to react to things that weren't his to react to. Mira had turned back to watching the corridor behind them. She put the phone in her jacket pocket, next to the folded paper with her mother's handwriting on it. She thought about the word come, about the 2 men in her father's apartment who wanted her to come, about the senator who had been running 20 years of organized crime from behind a public face, who had just had his inside man removed from the equation and his secondary plan, the perimeter breach, also failing to get her, which meant he had moved to the tertiary. The one that was supposed to work on her specifically because it always had. Her father. The lever that had never not worked. She breathed through it. She kept walking. At the end of the corridor, there were stairs, 6 of them, concrete, leading up to a metal door that Cord opened with a key code from memory. Cold night air came in. They were in the basement of a building that smelled like paper and old machines, some kind of storage or commercial space, and through the ground-level windows she could see the city, orange light, dark streets, the ordinary nighttime infrastructure of a place that didn't know what was happening in the house 3 blocks away. Her phone buzzed again. Not the unknown number this time. The secondary line, Cord's number, which Damien had said he'd use. She answered it. "Are you clear?" Damien's voice, tighter than usual, which was the first piece of evidence she'd had that the situation at the house was worse than what she'd seen. "We're clear. We're at the secondary location." "Good. Stay there. Don't—" A sound on his end. Something loud and percussive and close. Then silence. Then Damien's voice again, but differently pitched. Lower. Faster. "Elena, the files. The account information. Whatever you do with the next few hours, do not—" The call dropped. She stared at the phone. Cord said, "We need to go upstairs." And his voice had changed its quality, too. The professional calm was still there, but it was working harder now, which was the kind of thing you only noticed when you'd been reading people in crisis for 24 hours straight. She looked at the phone one more time. The dropped call sat there like a sentence without its end. She thought about a house 3 blocks away that was burning. She didn't know that yet, but she would, in 4 minutes, when Mira pulled up the property's external cameras on her phone and showed her. And she thought about Damien staying behind while the corridor door closed. And she thought about what he'd said at the dinner table the first night, in a tone that had no performance in it. No, just that. When she'd asked if he would hurt her. She had the paper. She had the account sequence and the server identifier and the word that would unlock 20 years of financial crime and bring down a senator who had been treating organized violence like an asset management portfolio. She had all of it in her inside pocket, zipped closed, 3 feet from her heart. And somewhere in the city, her father was in his apartment with 2 men he'd let in because he'd spent 30 years making himself useful to people who did not value him, and the only currency he'd ever had left to spend had been her. She climbed the stairs. Mira showed her the camera footage 4 minutes later. The east wing of the house orange and lit from within, smoke visible against the night sky. The camera angle showing the main structure still standing but the attached wing fully involved, and no visible sign of the people who'd been inside it. She looked at the footage for a long time. Then she looked at the account sequence she'd memorized, line by line, on the way through the corridor. Because, of course she had. Because she was her mother's daughter and her mother had been meticulous, and you did not carry irreplaceable information in a single location when you understood what irreplaceable meant. She looked at Cord. "I need a laptop," she said, "and I need to know who in this organization handles secure data transmission. Not Sasha. Someone else." Cord looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating its read of her. "There's someone," he said. "Get them on the phone," she said. "Now. Because the person running this operation against us just lost his inside access and his breach team, and he's about to find out that his leverage on my father isn't going to work either, and when he runs out of moves, he's going to make a decision about exposure, about whether to cut his losses or escalate to something we can't recover from. And I have 7 years of my mother's work in my jacket pocket, and I am not going to be the reason it sits there while a senator decides what to do next." She unzipped the inside pocket. She took out the folded paper. She held it in both hands in the yellow light of the storage room, looking at her mother's handwriting. The 4 lines, the careful precision of a woman who had known she was running out of time and had placed her most important work inside a notebook in her 17-year-old daughter's possession, trusting the weight of ordinary life to carry it through 7 years undisturbed. You'll know when it's time. The house 3 blocks away was on fire. Damien Viscari was somewhere inside a situation she could not see or control. Her father had spent 18 months feeding her daily life to people who wanted to use her. And Elena Ashcroft, 24 years old, standing in a storage room in borrowed clothes with a borrowed phone and a piece of paper that could end a 20-year criminal empire, understood with the total, clean, irrevocable clarity of someone who has just run completely out of road that the version of herself that drove to parking garages at midnight and sent money she couldn't afford and kept the defensive crouch so long it had reshaped her spine. That version was done. Whatever came next, it was going to be built from something different. She didn't know yet what that something was. She was going to find out. The laptop Cord produced was a matte black thing with no manufacturer logo, the kind of machine that had been deliberately stripped of its identity. He set it on a workbench in the back of the storage room and pulled up a contact on his phone simultaneously. And Elena watched him move with the economical efficiency of someone who had been trained to function inside chaos rather than despite it. "The person who handles secure transmission," she said. "Who is it?" "Her name is Petra. She's been with the organization for 6 years. Off-site. She works from a location that rotates. Ferris didn't know about her." He said the last sentence with the specific emphasis of someone delivering the most important piece of information. "You're certain?" Ferris built his access around Sasha. Sasha was his door into the communications infrastructure. Petra was built as a redundant system specifically because Mr. Vescari anticipated that the primary might be compromised. Cord looked at her with the expression of someone delivering information he wasn't entirely sure she'd been cleared for, and having decided that clearance was irrelevant given current circumstances. "He's been planning for a version of tonight for about 2 years. He planned for Sasha. He planned for someone. He didn't know who. That's different from planning for Sasha specifically." He dialed, put it on speaker. 2 rings, then a voice. A woman, low and precise, the kind of voice that had shed every non-essential quality. "Cord." Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Petra, I have Elena Ashcroft. She has the material." A beat. "Authenticated?" "She has Catherine Mercer's original document, the physical one." Another beat, this one with texture in it, the quality of someone rapidly recalculating. "Transmission protocol or direct input," Petra said. Elena leaned toward the phone. "Direct input. I have the sequence memorized. I need a secure channel to a financial crimes database that can cross-reference the account designation against active shell structures." A pause. "You know how to run that kind of cross-reference?" "I'm an accountant, and my mother trained me on financial modeling from the time I was 12. She paused 1 beat. "She thought she was teaching me professional skills. She was also leaving me a set of tools I'd need later. I understand that now." "The channel will take 6 minutes to establish," Petra said. "Don't input anything until I give you a clean signal. If the line is anything less than green, close the laptop and move." "Understood." The call stayed open, Petra working on her end in near silence, broken only by the sound of keystrokes and occasional low-voiced instructions she seemed to be giving to someone else in her location. Mira watched the ground floor windows. Cord stood near the door to the stairs. Elena sat in front of the laptop with the paper unfolded beside her, and the memorized sequence running through her head in the rhythm she'd locked it into in the tunnel. Grouped in 4s, the way she grouped account numbers at work, the way her mother had grouped numbers in the margins of everything she'd ever written. Her phone, the secondary line, buzzed. Unknown number, same prefix as her father's last call. She let it buzz. It stopped, then started again. She picked it up. Not her father's voice this time. "Mrs. Vescari." The voice was male, even, with a quality she could only describe as administrative. The voice of someone who had spent decades making his worst decisions sound like procedural matters. "I think it's time we spoke directly." She had never heard Senator Warren Aldis's voice before. She had seen him on screens, in photographs, in the civic background of a city that moved around him without knowing what he was. His voice matched his public face precisely, calibrated, reasonable, the voice of a man who had made a career of seeming like the most sensible person in any room. "How did you get this number?" she said. "The number isn't important. What's important is that you and I share a problem." A pause. "The documents you have access to, the financial records your mother assembled. If those records are transmitted to any law enforcement or media channel, the consequences will be extensive. Not just for me, for a significant number of people whose continued operation has actually maintained a kind of stability in this city. The organized violence you think those records will stop is violence that exists within a system I have managed for 20 years. Without that management, you're explaining organized crime to me as public service, she said. A slight pause. I'm explaining that the world is more complicated than the version that fits on a document. My mother spent 11 years documenting that complication, Elena said. She died before she could finish. I don't think she would have found your framing persuasive. She kept her voice level, the way she'd kept it level in the underground room and in the corridor and in every moment of the last 36 hours when level was a choice she was making consciously. What do you want? I want you to bring me the document, in person. I want to have a conversation about what comes next, about what your life looks like after this, about what your husband's organization looks like after this, about what kind of arrangement would allow everyone to continue operating. The word husband had something deliberate in it, an acknowledgement of the morning's documentation, which meant his information was current, which meant someone was still feeding him. You said Ferris was your channel, she said. Ferris is gone. Who told you about the marriage? A small silence. Someone has to have told you, she said. The ceremony was in a basement with 4 people. Ferris wasn't one of them. She thought fast. Reeves. The silence confirmed it before he said anything else, and she felt the information hit her like cold water. Reeves, with his 14 years and his careful stillness and his I knew your mother and his folder already in his jacket. Reeves, who had been in the corridor outside her room this morning waiting for her to wake. Reeves, who had known her mother, or who had said he'd known her mother. Reeves has been with me longer than he was with Vescari, Aldous said, and his voice had shifted slightly. The administrative quality was still there, but something underneath it had become more direct, as though having confirmed her knowledge, performance was no longer necessary. He came to Vescari's organization because I sent him there, 11 years before Ferris. Ferris was insurance. Reeves was the foundation. The storage room felt like it had gotten smaller. Then Damien, she said, right now, in the house. Mr. Vescari is currently dealing with a fire and an undermanned defensive situation and the discovery that someone he trusted for 14 years is not what he thought. Aldous paused. He's managing. He's a capable man, but he's managing without his 2 most senior people, in a compromised location, with incomplete information about where you are. You don't know where I am. No, but Reeves does. And Reeves has a phone. She looked at Cord. He was already moving. To the laptop, to the phone, his face doing something tight and fast. He pulled up something on his own device, and his expression went through a sequence she could read even at a distance. Search, confirm, harden. Reeves just pinged a location, Cord said. Quiet, controlled. His phone sent a signal in the last 60 seconds. She looked at the laptop. Petra's establishing channel was at 4 minutes, 2 more to go. She did the math. I need a decision from you, Aldous said on the phone. I want to be direct. I've lost 2 assets in the last 12 hours. I have resources that remain operational and I am prepared to use them. But I would prefer to resolve this through conversation because the alternative is what you're doing to the house, she said, a fraction of what I can do. Yes. And Damien. Depends on the next few minutes. She looked at the laptop, at the paper beside it, at Cord, who was doing something on his device quickly, and Mira, who had stepped closer to the stairs with her hand position changed. Give me a number, she said into the phone. Where you are. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. Elena? 5 minutes. Give me a number. He gave it. She ended the call. Petra, she said toward Cord's phone. 3 minutes. Petra said immediately, which meant she'd been listening. What's the minimum viable transmission? What's the smallest piece of the account information that creates a foothold, something a forensic team could use to pull the rest? A pause. Keystrokes. The 22-digit sequence alone, cross-referenced against the designation, gives you a point of entry into the primary archive. It's not the complete picture, but it's enough to establish the archive's existence and location. Enough for a financial crimes unit to issue a preservation order that prevents deletion. More keystrokes. If someone tries to destroy the records after that point, the preservation order creates a criminal obstruction charge. The cover-up becomes the crime. So transmit the sequence. As soon as the channel is green, don't wait for the rest. Understood. Who receives it? I have contacts at 3 federal financial crimes units, independent of each other, independent of this city's DA structure. Petra's voice had something in it that wasn't quite warmth, but was adjacent to it. The tone of someone doing the thing they've been positioned to do for a long time. Your mother sent me her preliminary work 4 years ago. She found me through a channel I still don't fully understand. I've been waiting for the key sequence. A pause. I've been waiting a long time. Something in Elena's throat did something complicated that she did not allow to become anything outward. Transmit the moment you're green, she said. She typed the 22-digit sequence into the laptop from memory, checked it against the paper once, checked it again. Beside it, she typed the account designation and the single-word identifier. She formatted it the way she would format any critical financial input, precise, labeled, with no ambiguity about what each element was. 1 minute. Cord said, "We have a vehicle outside. When Petra confirms transmission, we need to move before Reeves' signal gets here." "Where's Damien?" "I've been trying to raise him for the last 8 minutes. Nothing on the primary or secondary lines." She kept her face neutral. She kept her hand steady over the keyboard. "There's a third line," she said. "There's always a third line in a system built by someone who planned for tonight 2 years in advance." Cord looked at her. Then he looked at his phone and did something she couldn't see the screen of. And after a moment he said, "How did you know that?" "Because that's how my mother built things," she said. "Give me the number." She dialed. 4 rings. Then Damien's voice, rougher than she'd heard it. The controls still there, but working harder than usual. The sound of a man who was doing several things simultaneously and had managed to add a phone call to the list. "You're clear," he said. Not a question. "We're transmitting in under a minute. Petra has the channel, but Damien, it's Reeves. Reeves is Aldis's man. He's been there 14 years. A silence. 4 seconds. The quality of 4 seconds in which a person reconfigures everything they've been operating on. "Where is he now?" "He was with you, downstairs when we left." "He's not with me now." A sound on his end, something physical, movement, the environment around him in motion. "He went to secure the north exit 40 minutes ago. He sent a location ping from his phone. They know approximately where we are. Move, now. Don't wait for... We're waiting for the transmission. 60 seconds. Elena," his voice sharpened. "I need you to trust my assessment of the timeline. And I need you to trust mine," she said. 60 seconds. Then we move. A pause. "Are you hurt?" A beat. "Manageable." "Damien, 2 ribs, possibly. The fire is contained to the east wing. The main structure is clear. I have 4 people operational." A pause that had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. A quality she couldn't name from a single data point, but that felt like the texture of genuine uncertainty, which from him was as significant as anyone else shouting. Reeves knew everything, every protocol, every channel, every safe location. He helped build them. "Not Petra," she said. He didn't know about Petra. "No." "Then we have a channel, and in 40 seconds, we have a transmitted record that creates a federal foothold that Aldis can't delete without making it worse." She watched the progress indicator on Petra's channel. 25%. 30. "Aldis called me." "I know, I was listening." His voice had something flat and certain in it. "He offered you an arrangement." "He offered me a conversation about arrangements." "Same thing." "Yes." She watched the indicator. 50%. "I have his direct number." A pause. "Why do you have his direct number?" "Because I asked for it. Because I think the next move is not the one he's expecting." She watched the indicator climb. "He's lost Ferris. He's losing Reeves as an asset the moment you know about him. He's losing the archive the moment Petra's transmission goes through. What does he have left?" "Resources, people, the infrastructure of 20 years. Damien's voice was tight. "Don't underestimate what that looks like when it's motivated." "I'm not underestimating him. I'm counting on him to be exactly what he is." She watched the indicator. 70%. "He is a man who has survived 20 years by being the person who offers the arrangement. By making the other side believe a conversation is possible, he'll stay on the phone as long as he thinks there's a deal to be made. You want to use the call to keep him occupied. I want to use the call to locate him. She looked at Cord. Can Petra trace an active call? Cord was already moving the phone toward his mouth. Petra. Already on it, Petra said. Get her to call him and keep him talking for 90 seconds. I need 90 seconds of active signal. The indicator hit 100%. Transmission confirmed, Petra said. Federal Channel 1, 2, and 3. Preservation orders will be issued within the hour. Elena breathed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Move, Cord said, already at the stairs. She was on her feet with the laptop closed and the paper back in her pocket before he finished the word. Mira was already at the door. They went up the stairs in quick single file, through the storage space, out a side exit, into an alley that smelled like cold concrete and distant exhaust. A vehicle was there, unremarkable, dark-colored, running with its lights off. She got in the back with Cord while Mira took the passenger seat. She dialed Aldis's number. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he'd been waiting. I've thought about your offer, she said. Good. The administrative voice back to full performance. Where would you like to meet? Not yet. I have a question first. She kept her voice even and slightly uncertain, giving him the texture of a person on the edge of agreement. The arrangement you're describing, the one where everyone continues operating, what does that look like for Damien's organization specifically? Because he's my husband now, and whatever I agree to is something we'd have to discuss in person. I understand that. His voice had warmth in it, the managed kind, the kind that existed in service of an outcome. The details of any arrangement are always better handled face to face, less room for misunderstanding. And my father, she said, the men in his apartment. Already handled, he's fine. A pause. I want you to know that what happened tonight wasn't... I want to be clear that the level of force deployed against Mr. Vescari's property was not my preference. These situations escalate beyond their intended... Where are you? She said. I think that's something we discuss after you've agreed to... I'm close to agreeing, she said. I need to know if meeting is logistically possible. I need a general area. She put a slight note of exhaustion into her voice, the sound of a woman who had been running for hours and was close to the end of her resources. It was not entirely fictional. I've been in a car and a tunnel and a storage room for the last 2 hours. I just need to know if meeting tonight is even possible before I commit to the financial district, Aldis said. I have an office there, ostensibly for a legal practice. It's secure. In the front seat, Cord held up his phone. A screen showed a map with a blinking point in the financial district, east side, narrowed to a 2-block radius. She held the call for 4 more seconds, long enough for the trace to tighten, and said, I'll call you back in 30 minutes. She ended the call. Cord showed her the phone. The blinking point had resolved to a single building. She looked at it, looked at the address. She knew that building, not personally, but the way you know civic landmarks. It was a 16-story structure with a commercial legal facade, the kind of address that appeared on the letterhead of organizations that wanted to seem established without being specific about what they did. She had walked past it going to the courthouse. She had seen its name on a fundraising poster 2 weeks ago. The same poster. Aldis's face, serving our city. Does Damien have people in the financial district? She said. Cord was already on the phone. He's going to. She looked out the window. The city moved past in its nighttime version, the orange wash of streetlights, the dark spaces between, the ordinary infrastructure of a place that had no idea what was happening inside it. She thought about her mother at her desk, door slightly open, the sound of typing in the dark. She thought about 11 years of forensic financial work, 4 months of cancer, and 4 lines of handwriting folded inside a college notebook. She thought about Reeves. Cord, she said. Reeves, where is he? Cord checked something. Last signal from his phone was... He stopped. Signal dropped. 12 minutes ago. Damien, she said. Not a question. Cord said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She thought about 14 years and what a man does when he finds out that 14 years of his closest advisor were built on something that had been designed to hollow out everything he built. She thought about Damien in the burning house with 4 operational people and 2 broken ribs, and information he'd just received about the person he'd trusted longest. She thought about what capable looks like when it's also furious. The vehicle stopped. They were 6 blocks from the financial district building, parked on a street that had no foot traffic at this hour. Cord was on the phone in a low, fast voice she wasn't trying to parse. Mira was watching both directions through the windshield with the focused calm of a person who has decided that calm is a professional requirement. Elena had the folded paper in her hand again, without entirely noticing she'd taken it out. The last line, her mother's handwriting. "You'll know when it's time. I love you. Don't trust the one who seems safest." She had sent Reeves to her daughter to keep watch. 7 years of careful, distant, promised protection. And somewhere in those 7 years, or before them, Aldous had gotten to Reeves first or second, or had been there from the beginning, and Elena's mother's protection had been pointed at her by a man who served the person she'd been trying to expose. The recursion of it was almost mathematical. Her phone buzzed. "Damien." "We're 4 minutes out from the target building," he said. His voice had dropped back to the flat professional register, but she could hear something underneath it that she recognized now, a quality she'd been reading for 36 hours without having a name for it. She named it now, privately, in the time it took to respond. It was the sound of a man who was keeping himself operational through an act of will, who was doing the work while what he felt about the work sat waiting. "I have a location trace," she said. "Petra got 90 seconds of active signal. He's in the building. We have confirmation from a street-level contact. He arrived 40 minutes ago with 2 vehicles." A pause. "Reeves is not with him." "Where is Reeves?" "Being managed." The phrase again, the same one. She understood it better the second time. "Damien." She stopped. Started again. "Before you go into that building, I need to tell you something." "Tell me in the car. Cord knows where to bring you." He paused. "You're not staying outside." She had expected to argue about that. She didn't. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." "The evidence is transmitted. The federal channel is live. Whatever happens in the next hour, the archive exists and it's protected." His voice was exact, clinical. "What we're doing now is not about the evidence." "I know," she said. "What we're doing now is about a man who put people inside my organization for 14 years, who burned part of my house, who used your father as a mechanism and your mother's work as a weapon, and has been treating the city like a controlled experiment for 2 decades. A pause. Not for effect, for something more interior. "I want to look at him." She understood that too. 4 minutes, she said. 3 now. Move. The vehicle moved. She watched the city go past and thought about what she was doing, which was riding toward a confrontation with a man who had the resources of 20 years of protected criminal infrastructure and the instincts of someone who had survived this long by never being the most visible person in any situation. She thought about her mother going into Damien Vescari's organization with 11 years of work and asking for help. She thought about her 17-year-old self asleep down the hall, unaware. She thought about the notebook in her bag that had traveled with her through 6 apartments and had been waiting all that time to be opened. She thought, I am not the person who drove to that parking garage anymore. The building appeared through the windshield, glass and concrete, 16 stories, lit from within in the way of buildings that are occupied at the wrong hours for the wrong reasons. There were vehicles on the street outside that didn't have the profile of regular parking. Cord stopped the car 2 blocks short and killed the lights. Damien's vehicle was already there. She could see it, unmarked, 3 figures getting out and moving with the particular disciplined efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. She got out of the car before Cord could say anything. The night air hit her, cold, with the faint industrial edge of the financial district, a smell like money and machinery, and the particular atmosphere of power that doesn't have to announce itself. Damien saw her. He stopped for 1 second, just one, and looked at her across the distance with the expression she'd been trying to decode since the first night. And in this light, in this specific moment with the building lit behind her and the night around them, and 36 hours of everything they'd moved through together, sitting between them like a landscape, she finally read it clearly. It was the expression of a man who had promised a dying woman he would protect her daughter, and had spent 7 years not knowing if he would ever have the chance to make that mean something, and was now standing in the street outside the building where the person who had made those 7 years necessary was waiting. She crossed the distance between them. "The 2 men he put in my father's apartment," she said. "Handled." He looked at her, a comprehensive, unhurried look, the kind she'd learned to read as his version of checking, making sure she was intact and present. "You're okay." "Yes." She paused. "Your ribs." "Later." "Your ribs," she said again. Something moved in his expression, not a smile exactly. "Later," he said. "I promise." She nodded once. Around them, his people were moving into position with the soundless efficiency of a team that had operated together long enough not to need words. She watched them move and thought about Aldous in the building, waiting for a call back, managing his version of the situation, positioned behind 20 years of resources and calculation. She thought about what she'd said on the phone. "I think the next move is not the one he's expecting." She looked at Damien. "I want to go in first," she said. He looked at her. "Not alone, but first, before you." She held his gaze. "He's expecting a negotiation. He thinks I'm close to agreeing. If he sees me walk in, just me without an obvious security presence, he'll stay in the conversation. He'll try to close the deal before anything escalates." She paused. "The moment he sees you, the conversation ends and he moves to his last resource, whatever that is. I want 30 seconds inside before that happens. 30 seconds where he thinks he's winning." Damien was quiet. She watched him think. Not consider, actually think. The fast layered calculation of someone processing tactical and something else simultaneously. 30 seconds, he said. 30 seconds. Then we come in regardless of what's happening. Yes. He studied her for a moment with the full weight of that expression, the decoded one, the one that had 7 years in it. "Your mother," he said very quietly, "would have done exactly the same thing." She felt it land. She let it. "I know," she said. She turned toward the building. The entrance was 40 feet away. The lobby lights were on. Through the glass, she could see a security desk with no one at it, which meant Aldous had cleared the regular staff, which meant he was managing the space, which meant he was more anxious about this meeting than his voice had communicated. She walked toward this entrance with the folded paper in her jacket pocket, and 36 hours of a completely altered life behind her, and the understanding, clear and cold and without self-pity, that the next 30 seconds were going to require her to be the most convincing version of a woman who had not already won, in front of a man who did not yet know he had already lost. She pushed through the glass door. The lobby was empty except for one figure, standing near the far wall beside the elevator bank, in a dark suit that cost more than her monthly rent had cost, with the public face she knew from posters and press events, and the particular careful composure of a man who had spent 20 years never being in a room where he was not the most powerful person present. Senator Warren Aldous looked at her across the empty lobby. She looked back. "Elena," he said with the managed warmth, "I'm glad you came." She crossed the lobby toward him, keeping her pace unhurried, keeping her face in the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was here to discuss its terms, and behind her through the glass doors of the lobby, in the peripheral edge of her vision, she could see Damien and his people moving into position in the street, and she counted the seconds in her head, 1, 2, 3, and kept walking, and smiled at the senator with the specific smile of a woman who knows exactly what she's carrying and is finally ready to use it. She crossed the lobby at a pace she controlled with the same deliberate precision she'd used to cross every difficult distance in the last 36 hours. Not slow enough to seem hesitant, not fast enough to seem driven. The specific speed of a woman arriving at a decision she'd already made and was merely executing. Aldous watched her come with the expression of a man who had managed 1,000 negotiations and knew the body language of surrender. He was wrong about what he was reading. "You came alone," he said, when she was close enough to speak at a normal register. I came ahead, she said. There's a difference. Something moved in his expression, a fractional recalibration, but he absorbed it smoothly, the way a man absorbs things when he's had 20 years of practice, not reacting to information he doesn't like. He gestured toward a seating area near the elevator bank, low chairs, a glass table, the performance of a civilized space. Sit down, he said. She sat, not because he said so, because she needed him to think she was in the posture of a person having a conversation, and sitting was part of that. He sat across from her. He had the polished composure of a public figure in a private space, slightly more relaxed than his television version, but the architecture of control still intact. Late 50s, silver-haired, with a face that had been engineered by decades of careful presentation into something that photographed as trustworthy. She looked at that face and thought about her mother looking at financial records that traced back to it, 11 years of careful work building a case against something that wore this face. You transmitted the records, he said. It was not a question. Yes. He nodded slowly, as though receiving an expected weather report. Then we're past that point. We're past that point. Which means this conversation is about what comes next rather than whether the records exist. He placed his hands flat on his thighs. A deliberate gesture, she noted, of visible openness, the body language of a man presenting himself as non-threatening. I want you to understand that the records alone don't end anything. Evidence goes into a system. Systems take time. I have relationships inside that system that have been built and maintained for 2 decades. What happens with your mother's files, the timeline, the context in which they're introduced, the question of who interprets them, these are all things that remain negotiable. You're telling me you can slow walk the investigation. I'm telling you that I understand how these systems work in a way that most people don't. Evidence is the beginning of a process, not the end of one. He looked at her with the managed warmth still in place, a professional overlay. I'm offering to be useful to you in navigating that process, in exchange for a relationship that works for both of us. A relationship, she said. A practical one. You're intelligent. You have access to your husband's resources and your mother's methodology and a demonstrated ability to operate under pressure. He paused. These are things I can use. These are things I'm prepared to compensate generously. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about her mother at the home office desk, working late, doctor slightly open. She thought about a woman who had spent 11 years building a case against something that sat across from you and spoke about evidence as a negotiable resource and offered generous compensation for your cooperation. How many people have you made this offer to? She said. A small pause. Relevant people. Over the years. And they took it. Most of them. He said it without embarrassment. That's how this has worked for 20 years. Not through violence, through the basic human preference for a workable arrangement over an unwinnable fight. Reeves took it, she said. Reeves approached me, Aldous said, many years ago. He had concerns about the direction of Vescari's organization. He wanted a channel. I provided one. A slight shift in his posture. He was valuable. What happened tonight with him is unfortunate. What happened tonight with him? She repeated. You mean Damien finding out. I mean the waste of it. 14 years of positioning gone because you happened to be in the right corridor at the right moment. He looked at her with something that was almost genuine, an acknowledgement of the role chance played in outcome. Your mother was like that. She had an instinct for being in the right place. Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't talk to me about my mother in a way that suggests you knew her. You knew what she was doing. You tried to make sure she couldn't finish it. Those are not the same thing as knowing her. She kept her voice level. She died of cancer. I know that. You didn't have her killed, but you let the people who worked for you use her illness as cover. Let the timeline serve you. You didn't grieve the obstacle. You managed it. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt. She wasn't naive enough to look for guilt in that face, but recognition. The specific expression of someone being seen accurately who rarely is. She was remarkable, he said quietly, for what it's worth. It's worth nothing, Elena said. And you're stalling. He looked at her. For the first time in the conversation, she saw him actually recalibrate, not the small professional adjustments he'd been making throughout, but something more fundamental. A man who had run the longest version of every room he'd ever been in, recognizing that this room was running differently. "What are you waiting for?" he said. She looked at the glass doors of the lobby. Damien came through them. He came through them with 3 people behind him, and he moved across the lobby with the specific quality of a man who has already decided how the next portion of time is going to go and is simply enacting that decision. He was carrying the controlled fury she'd felt in him as a current since the corridor conversation about Reeves, and it was contained now, not gone. Contained, the way a fire is contained by someone who knows exactly how much oxygen to give it. He looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at him. The lobby held that for 3 seconds. Then Aldous said, with a composure that she had to acknowledge was genuinely impressive, "Damien, I've been expecting you." "I know," Damien said. "Sit down." And there it was, the phrase coming from the other direction, and Aldous receiving it with a slight compression around the mouth. That was the most visible reaction she'd seen from him. And he sat, because the 4 people now positioned around the lobby's perimeter had communicated something that overrode his instinct to manage the geometry of the room. What followed was not a conversation. It was closer to an accounting. Damien sat in the chair Elena vacated. She moved to stand, needing to be on her feet, and he laid out, in the flat, precise voice she'd been learning to read since the first night, the specific list of what Aldous had done and what evidence now existed documenting it. He was not performing for Aldous's benefit. He was not trying to break him or frighten him. He was reading a ledger. 38 criminal transactions, names, dates, account movements. The financial structure that had moved money between 6 crime families for 2 decades with the legal cover of a senator's office, providing protective interference. The operational relationship with Ferris, whose phone had been thoroughly examined in the hours since his detention. The longer relationship with Reeves, confirmed through documents Reeves himself had maintained. The particular irony of a meticulous man's record-keeping becoming the instrument of his exposure. Aldous listened. He stopped performing composure about 4 minutes in, which meant the actual performance had lasted 4 minutes, which Elena noted as a data point about how long his management of difficult information held before the human reality underneath it surfaced. What surfaced wasn't panic. It was something older, the expression of a man who had known, at some unacknowledged level, that a version of this night existed in his future and had been managing the possibility for long enough that its arrival carried a specific tired quality alongside everything else. "The federal preservation orders were issued 40 minutes ago," Damien said. "The archive exists in 3 independent federal systems. Deletion is now an obstruction felony. The accounts are frozen pending investigation." He paused. "You have no inside access to the units receiving this material. I made certain of that before we came here." "How?" Aldous said. "Your financial connection to the Deputy Director of Financial Crimes went into the archive. He was removed from the receiving chain before the transmission." Damien looked at him. "You built your protection through relationships. We documented the relationships first." Aldous was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, flat on his thighs still, the deliberate gesture of openness now looking like what it always was, a practiced position. He looked at Elena, who was standing to the side, and his expression when it landed on her had something in it she hadn't expected. Not anger, something closer to recognition, the kind that comes too late. "She gave it to you," he said. "Catherine. She hid it with you." "She gave it to me when I was 17 and she was dying," Elena said. "She hid it in something so ordinary I didn't look at it for 7 years." "A notebook," he said. Not a guess. There was something in his voice that suggested he'd run the possibilities over years, and this was the configuration that resolved them. She always kept notebooks. "She kept everything," Elena said. Aldous nodded once, very slowly, the nod of a man arriving somewhere he'd been traveling toward without choosing to. "What happens now?" he said. Not to Damien, to her. She looked at him. She thought about the question, which was a real one. What happened to a senator whose criminal infrastructure had just been documented and transmitted to 3 federal units, whose operational assets had been removed or neutralized, who was sitting in a lobby with 4 armed people and a woman whose mother he'd spent 7 years being unable to outmaneuver? "You're going to get in a vehicle," she said, "and you're going to go wherever Damien's people take you, and you're going to spend the next several months being interviewed by people who will use what my mother built to ask very specific questions. And you're going to answer them. Not because you've decided to cooperate. I'm not going to tell you that's the right thing to do. You can make your own decisions about that. But because the alternative is watching your protection evaporate layer by layer while the evidence does its work without you, and my mother built it well enough to do that with or without your cooperation." He looked at her for a long moment. "She did build it well," he said, quietly, with something genuine in it. "Yes," Elena said. "She did." She looked at Damien. He was already looking at her. He gave a slight nod to the man standing at Aldous' left, and the next few minutes were operational, precise and unemotional, Aldous rising from the chair and being guided toward a side exit, the kind of movement that had the quality of a long-rehearsed procedure finally being executed. He went without resistance, which she noted and filed. The lobby was empty of his presence within 4 minutes. She stood in it afterward with Damien a few feet away, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The silence had a different quality from the engineered silences of the house. This one was the silence of something having completed. The specific quiet after a long process reaches its end. "Your ribs," she said finally. "2 confirmed." He said it without pretense. Cord's got medical on standby at the secondary location. "Okay." She paused. "Reeves. In custody. He'll go through the same process as Aldous. Different evidence, different charges. The documentation he kept himself was—" He stopped. Something in his expression moved through the tectonic shift she'd learned to read. "He was thorough. It makes the case against him thorough. He knew my mother." "Yes." A pause. "He was genuine about that. Whatever else he was, that was real. He watched me for 7 years," she said, "from a distance, making sure I was safe. And he was working for the man my mother was trying to expose the whole time." Damien was quiet. "She trusted him enough to tell him about me," Elena said. "She didn't know. She built the most careful architecture of protection she could around her daughter, and she didn't know the foundation had a crack in it." She paused. "She's still got it right. The notebook, the 4 lines, the warning about trusting the one who seems safest. She didn't know it was Reeves specifically, but she knew the structure well enough to design around the possibility." "She was the most precise person I've ever worked with," Damien said. "She thought in systems." "She thought in people," Elena said. "Systems built from how people actually behave, not how they're supposed to." He looked at her with the decoded expression, the one she'd named in the street outside. Something in it had shifted slightly, moved further from its controlled surface, closer to whatever it was under the architecture of the man he'd built himself into over decades. "We should go," he said. "Yes." They went. The secondary location was a property she hadn't seen before. A townhouse in a residential neighborhood, the kind of address that existed inside the city's texture rather than outside it. Cord had medical there. A woman in her 40s who worked with the focused efficiency of someone who found sentimentality counterproductive and injuries interesting. She examined Damien's ribs with her hands, told him 2 were cracked rather than broken, gave him a compression wrap and something for the pain with the information that it would work in 40 minutes, and left him with instructions he would not follow to the letter. Elena sat in a kitchen that smelled like other people's ordinary lives, coffee and dish soap and the faint ghost of a meal cooked days ago, and drank water because someone had put a glass in front of her and her body needed it, and thought about her father. She thought about him for a long time, not in the recursive way of the last 36 hours, running his choices through analysis, looking for the angle that made them comprehensible. Just thought about him, the actual texture of him, which was a man who had spent 61 years being charming and irresponsible and genuinely incapable of sustaining any commitment that asked more of him than the immediate moment. A man who had loved her in the partial, unreliable way of people who love what they can manage to love without too much discomfort. A man who had sold her for $50,000 because the debt was real, and the payment was immediate, and she was the only asset he had left that he hadn't already spent. She didn't forgive him. She was not ready to forgive him, and she didn't know if she ever would be, and she was not going to pretend a resolution about that because pretending resolutions about her father was what she'd been doing since she was 15, and it had cost her 20 years of arriving to parking garages at midnight. But she was done letting the debt he owed her organize her life around its collection. That was different from forgiveness. It was more practical than forgiveness. It was the decision of a woman who had run out of runway for carrying other people's weights and needed the space for something else. She did call him. 48 hours after the lobby, from a clean phone with cord in the next room and the autumn light coming through windows that looked onto a courtyard she'd been walking in because motion was how she processed things. Her father answered on the second ring. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for the call and was afraid of it in equal measure. "The men are gone," he said immediately. "From the apartment. The police came. I called like you said." "Good. Elena, Dad." She sat down on a low bench in the courtyard. The air was cold and clear. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. Not what you want, not what you're hoping for. What's going to happen. There will be people who contact you about what you did, what you told them, what you agreed to, the payments you received. You are going to tell them the truth. All of it. Not a managed version. The truth." "Elena, all of it," she said again. "Because the alternative is that you become part of the prosecution rather than a peripheral witness. And you are 61 years old, and I am not going to watch that happen if you have the option to avoid it." She paused. "This is the last thing I'm going to do to help you with this. After this, what happens is what you make happen. I can't keep being the person who drives to the parking garage." A silence. Long enough that she counted it. 8 seconds. 9. "I know," he said. His voice had the stripped quality again, the one she'd heard in the parking garage before she'd understood what it meant. "I know you can't. Tell me you understand what I'm asking. Tell the truth, all of it." He said it flatly, not performing compliance, just repeating it back, the way a man does when he's too tired to do anything but the direct thing. "I understand." She stayed on the line for a moment. There was nothing else that needed to be said, and she knew it, and she also knew that ending the call was going to feel like something final. Not his death, not a dramatic rupture, but the closing of a chapter that had been the organizing structure of her adult life. And it was going to hurt in the specific quiet way of things that hurt, not because they're violent, but because they're true. "Okay," she said. She ended the call. She sat in the courtyard with her phone in her hand and the sky going the particular shade of gray that preceded rain in this city, and she let the cold air do what cold air does, which is remind you precisely of the boundaries of your body, and she sat inside those boundaries for a while without trying to be anywhere else. Damien found her there 20 minutes later. He came out through the courtyard door and looked at her, the comprehensive, unhurried look she knew now as his version of checking, and sat down on the bench beside her with the careful positioning of a man with 2 cracked ribs who was not going to acknowledge that it hurt. "You called him," he said. "Yes." "How was it?" "Finished," she said. The word came out with more weight than she expected. She let it. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, which was the right thing to do, and she noted it. They sat for a moment in the courtyard with the gray sky above them and the city going about its business on the other side of the wall, and she thought about all the things that existed now that hadn't existed 3 days ago. The federal investigation that was already generating its first interviews, the collapsed infrastructure of 6 crime families whose financial insulation had been removed overnight, the specific chain of accountability that started with her mother's 11 years of work and ended with a 22-digit sequence memorized in an underground corridor. She thought about the east wing of the house, which Cord had confirmed was structurally repairable. She thought about Ferris and Aldous and Reeves, each at different points in a process that would take months and produce outcomes that were not yet determined. She thought about Sasha, who who had opened the east gate and whose current location was in a form of custody that fell somewhere between the laws and the organizations, and whose cooperation was apparently useful enough that decisions about her had been deferred. She thought about her mother's notebook, which was in her bag in the room she'd been given in this house, back inside, upstairs. She was going to keep it, not as an artifact of the crisis, but because it was her mother's, and her mother had used it to save her, and objects that carry that kind of weight deserve to be kept. "When this is over," she said, not meaning the immediate crisis that was over or at its end, meaning the longer process, the federal investigation, the restructuring, the legal architecture of what came after. "What does your organization look like?" Damien was quiet for a moment. "Smaller," he said. "Legitimate, mostly. There are people who've been with me for a long time who know how to do things that have nothing to do with crime, real estate, logistics, security consulting. Those parts have always existed alongside the other parts." He paused. "I've been thinking about the other parts for a while. The archive your mother built, the exposure. It accelerates a timeline I was already moving toward. You were planning to get out." "I was planning to change the shape of things. Get out implies there's somewhere outside to be." He looked at the courtyard wall. "The people who work for me, some of them have done things I can't walk back, but some of them have just lived inside a structure because the structure was what existed, and they were good at what the structure needed. Those people deserve a different structure." She thought about Cord and Mira, moving through the tunnel in the dark. She thought about Petra, waiting 4 years for a key sequence, transmitting it to 3 federal channels at 2 in the morning. "The marriage," she said. He looked at her. "We signed it in a basement during a fire," she said, "with 2 cracked ribs and a dropped phone call. That's what it was when it happened." She paused. "I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened. I'm saying what it was." "I know what it was," he said. "What happens to it now is a different question from why it happened." She looked at him directly. "You made a promise to my mother. That's not the same as making a promise to me. I want you to understand that I know the difference." He looked at her for a long moment, the tectonic movement again, beneath the surface. "Yes," he said, "I know the difference." "Okay," she paused. "I'm not going anywhere. I want to be clear about that. I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I spent 36 hours inside a situation that turned my entire understanding of my own history inside out. I found out my father sold me. I found out my mother built a 7-year time bomb inside a college notebook. I found out a man I'd just learned to read had been placed in the organization I was supposed to be protected by before the organization existed." She looked at her hands. "I'm not going anywhere. But I'm not pretending those things didn't happen either. Whatever comes next, I'm building it from what's actually true, not from what I needed to be true before I knew better." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the first drops of rain began to fall, light and preliminary, tapping at the stones of the courtyard with the tentative quality of something testing its welcome. "Your mother said something to me," he said. "The last time I saw her, she told me that the work she was doing was the most important thing she'd ever built, but that it wasn't the thing she was most proud of." He paused. "She said the thing she was most proud of was a 24-year-old woman who didn't know she was carrying everything her mother had trusted her with. She said you were the most careful accountant she'd ever known, and what she meant by that wasn't that you were good with numbers." Elena sat with that, sat inside it, let the rain fall lightly around it. She did not cry. She hadn't cried through any of it. Not in the parking garage, not in the underground room, not in the corridor with Reeves's words settling into her, not in the storage room with the footage of the burning house on Mira's phone. She didn't cry now. What happened instead was something quieter, a release of pressure, internal and structural, the way a building settles after the forces acting on it have been resolved. She sat inside that for a long time. The rain came in more fully. Damien got up with the careful movement of his ribs and said nothing about going inside, which was the right thing, and after another few minutes she stood as well. They went in through the courtyard door. The kitchen still smelled like other people's ordinary lives, and she stood in it for a moment before moving further into the house, and thought about the specific ordinariness of what she wanted, which was not empire or resolution or even justice exactly, but something smaller and harder to name. the ability to make choices that were actually hers, in a life that was actually built from her own materials, without the organizing weight of someone else's crisis determining her direction. She had that now. For the first time in her adult life, she had that. The investigation went on for 4 months. She was interviewed 7 times by 3 different federal units, and each time she was precise and organized and presented information in the format of someone who understood both the content and the systems it was entering, and the investigators she worked with stopped looking at her like a witness. 2 sessions in and started looking at her like something they didn't have a category for, which she took as a professional compliment. Aldous entered a cooperation agreement in the 2nd month. His testimony did more damage to the remaining infrastructure than anything else in the archive, because he had spent 20 years inside the relationships, and the relationships were the architecture, 6 families, 32 indictments, a deputy director of financial crimes removed and subsequently charged, 2 sitting legislators referred for ethics investigation, and 1 referred for criminal investigation. The city's political structure didn't collapse. Cities don't collapse. But it shifted, the way a body shifts after something that has been pressing on it from the inside is finally removed. Her father testified. She knew this from the investigators, not from him. He was classified as a cooperating peripheral witness and received a conditional immunity agreement that she had no hand in negotiating and that she felt about with the complicated flatness of someone who has finished feeling the acute version of something and is now living in the chronic residue. She didn't see him. She didn't call him. She didn't prevent the immunity from happening. She let the process do what processes do. Reeves pled to a reduced set of charges in the 3rd month. She read the filing and noted in the section on mitigating factors that his attorney had submitted documentation of 7 years of active monitoring to ensure the safety of Elena Ashcroft, which the prosecution had acknowledged as a material fact even within the context of his betrayal of the organization he'd been placed inside. She read that section twice. She didn't know how to feel about it, and she stopped trying to resolve it into a feeling and let it be what it was. True, and also terrible, and also, in some limited structural way, a form of the promise being kept even while being broken. Ferris did not cooperate. His case went to trial. Sasha cooperated fully. Her cooperation opened sections of the financial archive that Petra hadn't been able to access independently. The investigation team told Elena this in the 5th interview, and she nodded and noted it and went home and sat in the room she'd been given in a house that was being repaired, listening to the sound of construction on the east wing, which had the particular rhythm of something being rebuilt rather than replaced. The east wing was finished in the 5th month. On the morning it was finished, she walked through it. The smell of new construction, cut wood, fresh paint, the particular chemical quality of new materials, was strange against the bones of the old house, which she'd been living inside long enough to know. She walked through the new rooms, which were bright with unfinished light, and came out through a door that led to the courtyard where it had rained that night, and stood in it in the November cold. Damien found her there again. He had the quality now of a man who was doing the slower work of building something, less the taut operational efficiency of the crisis period and more the deliberate steadiness of someone laying foundations. He was sleeping. She knew this because she could tell when he wasn't, and he was. He was managing the legitimate restructuring of a network that had operated on violence for 30 years, and it was not easy work, and it was not clean, and he was doing it with the same flat precision he brought to everything, without performance and without shortcuts. She had been doing her own work. She had gone back to accounting, not the firm she'd left, a different one that did forensic financial analysis for legal and investigative practices. Her credentials and her experience and, frankly, her recent history made her extremely employable in that specific field. The investigator on the 3rd Federal Unit had told her, at the end of their last session, that if she was interested in consulting work, there were channels for that. She told him she'd think about it. She was thinking about it. She stood in the courtyard in November and looked at the sky, which was the clear, hard blue of late autumn, and felt the cold in the specific edges of her body, and thought about a notebook in her bag and a woman who had worked late with the door slightly open and had loved her daughter by building around her a protection so careful it had survived 7 years and 2 layers of betrayal and come through intact at the end, its key carried by someone who hadn't known she was carrying it. Damien stood beside her, and they looked at the sky together for a while. And she thought about the word husband in the administrative sense, which was what it had been. And she thought about what it had become over the months of a process they'd moved through together without pretending to know each other better than they did, because he was not a man who pretended, and she was no longer a woman who absorbed other people's projections. And what it had become was still forming, still finding its shape, neither of them pushing it toward a conclusion before it was ready. That was enough. It was genuinely, practically, truly enough, and she was not going to perform certainty about it that she didn't have. Petra called, he said. The 3rd Federal Unit is closing its active phase. They're moving into the prosecution stage. I know, they called me too. He nodded. She reached into the pocket of her jacket, not the inside pocket, the outside one, and took out the folded paper. She'd been carrying it since the storage room, every day. Not because she needed it, the content was in 3 federal systems and in her own memory, but because she needed to carry it, needed the specific weight of it, small and soft and present. She looked at her mother's handwriting one more time. The 4 lines, the number sequence, the account designation, the single word that had opened an archive 7 years in the making, and the last line, the one she'd been reading in pieces for months, had turned over in different lights, had understood differently at different moments. You'll know when it's time. I love you. Don't trust the one who seems safest. She folded the paper. She held it in her hand for a moment, in the cold November air of the courtyard, with the rebuilt East Wing behind her and Damien beside her, and the city going about its ordinary life beyond the stone wall. Then she put it back in her pocket. Not because she wasn't done with it, because it was her mother's handwriting, and her mother had loved her with the most careful, practical, enduring love she'd ever known. And some things you carry not because they're useful, but because they're yours and they matter, and you don't put down the things that matter just because the crisis that revealed their weight is over. She zipped the pocket closed. She breathed in the cold air. She thought about a 24-year-old woman who had driven to a parking garage at midnight because her father called, and who had walked into a room and been told she had 72 hours, and who had found a piece of paper in a college notebook and carried it through a tunnel and a fire and a lobby confrontation and 4 months of federal investigation and a courtyard in November. She thought about that woman with something that was not pride exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific feeling of looking at what you turned out to be capable of and finding that it was more than you had known to expect. The city moved beyond the wall. The sky held its clear, hard blue. Somewhere in the house, the sounds of ordinary operation, people moving, the low register of work being done, the infrastructure of a life that was not what it had been and not yet entirely what it would be, but real and present, and being built with materials that were actually true. She looked at Damien. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, which was right, because what was there to say about the particular quality of 2 people standing in the same place, having come from different directions through the same storm, finding that the ground on the other side was solid enough to build on? She turned and went back into the house. He followed. The door to the courtyard closed behind them, and outside it the November air moved through the space they'd left, and the courtyard was empty and cold and very quiet, the way places are quiet when the things that needed to happen in them have finally happened.